So we're going to begin tonight by introducing our panelists. Before we do that, though, a few housekeeping items. We did ask for you to submit any questions that you might have had in advance through our Qualtrics link, and many of you took advantage of that. So thank you so much for starting that process for us. And we all are still going to be taking questions live during the event. So if you have any questions for our panelists tonight, you can enter them into the chat and we will be monitoring that. If for some reason a question that you submitted either early in advance through the portal or through the chat does not get answered tonight, just know that we will be taking any questions that we were not able to get to during the event, and we will be forwarding them to our Ask the Experts inbox. Kyle mentioned that we had that Ask the Experts portal on our website, which you can use at any time, and that links to an inbox, and our experts will be getting back to you via email if your question did not get answered tonight. So I encourage you all to put your questions into the chat if you have them live during the event. And then we're going to get started. So I would like to first introduce our panelists. We're going to start with Dr. Mike Fugaro. Dr. Fugaro is an equine veterinarian and surgeon in New Jersey. He is an alumni of the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. He completed his large animal internship at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and a large animal surgical residency at Purdue University. Dr. Fugaro is the current president of the New Jersey Association of Equine Practitioners, an advisory board member for the Rutgers University Board for Equine Advancement, and an alumni representative for the admissions committee for the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. So we're very happy to have Dr. Fugaro with us tonight.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Kenneth McKeever. Ken McKeever received his BS degree and MS degrees in animal science from California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, and Fresno State University, and earned his PhD in animal physiology at the University of Arizona. On a basic level, Dr. McKeever's research has focused on comparative exercise and cardiovascular physiology, with a particular interest in the effects of aging on the integration of the cardiovascular, renal, and endocrine systems in the control of blood pressure, blood volume, and fluid, and electrolyte balance. On an applied level, his research has focused on the effects of performance-enhancing practices on the physiological responses of the equine athlete. Dr. McKeever was the first equine exercise physiologist to be named a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine, and he is the first and only equine physiologist named a fellow by the American Physiological Society. Dr. McKeever currently serves as Associate Director of the Rutgers Equine Science Center. So thank you, Dr. McKeever, for joining us tonight. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Karen Malinowski. Dr. Malinowski is a founding director of the Rutgers Equine Science Center at the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. She has served as a faculty member at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences since 1978 in various roles. These include as an extension specialist in equine sciences, animal sciences professor, founding director of the Equine Science Center, and director of Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Her research and extension programs concentrate on improving the well-being and quality of life of the equine athlete while ensuring the vitality and viability of the equine industry, both statewide and nationally. Dr. Malinowski played a lead role in building the equine science program at Rutgers University and in the formation of the Rutgers Equine Science Center. So thank you, Dr. Malinowski. Next, we have Dr. Michael Westendorf. Dr. Westendorf is an extension specialist in animal sciences at Rutgers University, where he has been employed since 1993. Dr. Westendorf is originally from Idaho, where he received his bachelor's degree in animal science from the University of Idaho in 1980. He received his master's degree in 1988 and his PhD in 1992. Both degrees were in animal science from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Westendorf conducts research and extension programs in the uses of food byproducts as animal feeds and the environmental sustainability of livestock farms. So thank you, Dr. Westendorf.
Glad to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Carrie Williams. Dr. Williams earned her doctorate degree with an emphasis on equine nutrition and exercise physiology in June 2003 from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. She holds a master's degree in equine nutrition, also from Virginia Tech, and a bachelor's degree in equine science from Colorado State University. She joined Rutgers University in July 2003 as its equine extension specialist and associate director of outreach for the Equine Science Center, taking an active role in teaching, conducting research, and working with the equine and academic communities to ensure the viability of the horse industry in New Jersey. So thank you, Dr. Williams. We have a great panel, as you can see here tonight, and we're gonna jump right into our questions. I know everybody is like, oh my God, please don't pick on me first. So we're gonna take a question that's going to be directed at Dr. Fugaro and Williams. So maybe they can lead us off here. This question was submitted by Pauline from Auburn, Washington. And Pauline asks, my question is regarding rain sheets. I live in Washington State. Washington is quite rainy in the winter, usually showers, light rain, but not a lot of heavy rain. The temperature is mostly mild, not a lot of freezing weather. The horses are either taken into their stalls at night or, if kept out, have three-sided loafing sheds. All the horses have wall-less rain shelters in their paddocks. Is it necessary to keep the rain sheets on 24/7? How often should the sheets be removed in order to have healthy skin? I am concerned that wearing the sheets continually in 40 to 60 degree weather will cause skin issues, especially if the horse sweats under the sheet.
I guess that's me first, huh? Yeah, I'll start. I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule on it because, I don't believe that sheets are a requirement for all horses. I have plenty of horses in my practice in this area that never get a blanket or sheet or anything put on them through the winter, and they do perfectly fine. The one thing that we do see, we tend to see a lot of blanket rubs. We tend to get kind of a quasi rain rot underneath, which is basically a dermatitis that falls along the top line of the horse. And so every horse is going to be different. I think the biggest key, and a lot of people will put the sheets on for the winter and they just don't come off. I think the biggest key on that is you got to take them off. You got to let the horse air out. You got to wash your blankets and sheets when you can, dry them out, and give them time. So I think once you get into a dermatitis condition, then the challenge is you got to get them out of those blankets. I have several barns that probably have hand-me-down blankets and sheets, particularly in the winter time, and they tend to get wither rubs, and they're a real pickle to get under control. And the solution is take the blankets off them. In a lot of my practice, my clients will clip those horses for the winter time. So consequently, they do have to have something on because they just don't have the thermal protection from their hair. But if you let them grow it, they'll grow it and they'll be absolutely fine out in the winter.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add. I think Mike hit on all the points that I was going to say. And, my horses are kind of the same way. They don't wear one if they don't need one. So good job, Mike.
Thanks.
Great. And we have another question here that maybe could use the input of a veterinarian. What are your thoughts on worming these days? My vet says that with people moving away from wormer rotations and only doing work based on fecal samples, spots, and other things have been slowly increasing. What's your recommendation for a worming rotation? And this is from Lisa in Ringgoes, New Jersey.
Well, Lisa, it's a great question, and it's something that I think we're all trying to change our viewpoint, because for years we went by a different approach, and we were wrong by how we did that. And I guess the one correction I'll have to say is it's deworming, not worming. We're not giving them worms. We're trying to get rid of them. And the one thing, and it took me quite a while to finally get on board, because I'm of the generation of the rotational deworming every 2 months. And somebody pointed out to me, they said, well, you don't go and give this antibiotic on this month and then wait 2 months and then give another course of antibiotics of this just randomly. And everybody said, well, of course you would, because you'll get antibiotic resistance. Well, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing deworming resistance, and we're seeing it resistance to some of the big gun dewormers like the ivermectins or avermectin categories. So what we really do recommend at this point is what we call fecal egg counts. We usually recommend clients at an entire barn. We actually hope that the whole barn will do this. And what you'll look at is the fecal or the egg loads that we see, the parasite loads, for lack of a better term, within the farm and also within each individual horse. And I think that's the important part. And then we basically tailor a deworming program for them. In my practice, I basically have 3 categories of a high, moderate, and low shedding level. And we have different dewormers that we'll recommend for it. But I think the key is I have some barns that I don't have them dewormed for a year or 2 because they have 3 horses in the backyard and their egg counts have always been extremely low. So I think it is very individualized, and we have definitely over dewormed through the year. So we're trying to improve upon that and decrease the basically resistance from these parasites.
Thank you, Dr. Fugaro. And I think from that, we can easily segue into some questions about pasture and manure management. So these would be directed at Dr. Williams and Westendorf. And the first question that we have, it's kind of a combination question that was posed both by Lisa from Ringo's, New Jersey, as well as Jessica from Hackettstown, New Jersey. What are your thoughts on dragging a field to spread the manure versus picking the field? I heard that if you drag it in the sunshine, the UV rays will kill anything. Is this true? How often should you pick manure from your paddocks or spread?
Carrie, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Yep. I was just debating on what you wanted me to do. So, yeah, I think as long as you can spread the manure so that it's a thin enough layer, you are doing good. The problem is sometimes if you're overstocked, you have too many horses and you leave the manure too long, it ends up being a really thick mat or a really thick mass. And then no matter what you do to spread it, you're still leaving that layer of thick manure there. So that the key is to really spread it when it's hot, dry, and a very thin layer, and then that'll help kill some of those parasites. So that's the best time to do it.
I would just follow up by saying it's my own bent is towards dragging your pastures on a regular basis, breaking up the manure clumps, and as Carrie said, making them accessible to the sunlight to help break down. About picking, if you've got an exercise lot, yeah, you probably need to pick that occasionally, but not your pastures, especially if you've got a larger amount of acreage. You certainly don't ever want to have to pick the pastures on larger acreages, and dragging should be sufficient.
Great, thank you both. And we have one more follow-up pasture question that we are going to address at this time. This is also from Jessica in Hackettstown. Jessica asks, what do you recommend for getting horses as much turnout as possible, but also maintaining nice fields, i.e. turnout after a lot of rain or wait for the field to dry out? Also, how often should you rotate paddocks?
I'm going to use the very famous extension answer as it depends. Right. It depends on so many variables. Yes, rotational grazing is the way to go. So glad you're using that. However, as you mentioned, when pastures are really wet and muddy, you really don't want to let horses out because they're just going to make things worse by chewing up the grass and chewing up the ground. And how often should you rotate? Well, we like to look at the grasses. So I can't really tell you time frame and say, well, 7 days, 5 days, 10 days. You really have to watch the grass. So we use what's called a take half, leave half rule. So most of our grasses like to grow best when they're about 6 to 8 inches tall. So that's when we graze them. And then we'll take half of that down. So we'll take it down to about 3 or 4 inches. And that's when you need to stop grazing. Because, and the reason why is if you start grazing too much past that point, you're killing the root system of the grasses. So I know a lot of the grasses out there and a lot of farms that I've been to are this little like 1 or 2 inch stubble. And people say, well, if I rest it long enough, it'll come back. False. And Jen, I know you can attest to this. One of her very first studies while she was here at Rutgers was looking at recovery of overgrazed pastures. And did it ever come back, Jen?
No, it didn't. It didn't really. So it took like 9 months of complete rest after winter. So full winter rest, and then 9 months. So basically till August before we saw herbage mass. So that's the yield, the pasture yield. Before that became similar, and so species composition though never returned. So there were differences in the proportion of weeds and planted grasses and even bare ground that persisted through the end of the study.
Yeah. So really the key is if you get to that point, you're going to have to do some sort of renovation. And some of the renovation is going to be the no-till, drill some more grasses into your existing base. But then you got to make sure that you've soil tested, you've fertilized, and done all your homework before that point. But I think the key is don't ever let it get to that point and you don't have to worry about it. And then the key is there to have a proper stress lot or some other area where you can put these horses. And I never say stalls. I really love having the stress lots because then you are keeping horses outside. You're letting them move around. You're letting them be in the environment and interact with other horses. But it's, you know, you have to do what is best for your farm and the goals of your farm.
That's good.
Okay, thank you guys very much. We're going to transition just a little bit now and take a look at the older horse. So this first question will be primarily for Dr. Williams, that still focuses on the nutrition side of things. And it comes from Karen in Cranford, New Jersey. She says, my two horses are both seniors, ages 26 and 28 years. They're boarded in a barn, turned out all day, and in at night during winter, out all night and in during the hottest parts of the day in the summer. Access to some grass when turned out, and they receive mixed grass hay while in the barn and Purina senior feed, along with Manna Pro stabilized rice bran. Do you recommend supplementing them with selenium and vitamin E at any time during the year? And if so, what are the current recommendations on doses?
That's a great question. The one little piece of information that I'm missing, however, is exactly what those horses do. Because I know a lot of 25, 26-year-old horses that are still actively either competing or ridden, but she doesn't mention that. So I'm going to just assume that they're pasture pets or they're pets. And if that is the case, as long as they're on a good quality forage, which it sounds like they are with the pasture, and she also has them supplemented with a commercial grain, that should be adequate. And she shouldn't need to supplement anything above and beyond that, particularly selenium. I am never a fan of supplementing selenium to any horses unless I know exactly what's in the diet. And the problem there is there's so many different hays from around the country, not just hays from New Jersey, that it's hard for me to guess how much selenium is going to be in the hay. And since selenium is so quickly toxic to horses, I don't really ever recommend supplementing selenium unless I am 100% sure that the hay, the forage, and the ground that they're grazing is in a deficient area, which we are not. Vitamin E, on the other hand, I can talk about that totally separately, because if these horses are in a stressful situation, which again, it doesn't really sound like they are, but if they were still competing, then they might benefit from a vitamin E supplement, and they can go anywhere from 1,000 IU per day up to, you know, if they're really heavily competing, you know, 2,500, even up to 5,000 IU per day, depending on that animal. But again, if these are just pastured horses and they're on a good quality forage, I think that diet sounds just fine.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Williams. And so this leads perfectly into our next question, which will go to Dr. Malinowski, because Dr. Williams brought up the idea of exercising older horses. So this question comes from Jessica in Spring Valley, Wisconsin. So Dr. Malinowski, are there any special considerations to keep in mind when exercising the older horse? And what level of exercise would be appropriate for an older horse?
Okay. The older horse will let you know how much exercise it can accommodate. Lord Nelson at age 39 was still galloping around trying to buck people off. and had no anti-inflammatories. His old bones creaked as you were galloping up the hills, but he was still going like a trooper. The key is that, and it's a great question that we recommend in our lecture that we started this off in August, is that exercise is important as the horse gets older. For a variety of reasons. Conditions that you might have to worry about, the horse does not thermoregulate as it did when it was younger, and so you certainly would not exercise a horse over the age of 20 in a hot July midday afternoon in the blazing sun with 90% humidity. They cannot tolerate, they can't thermoregulate or sweat to the extent that they did when they were younger. So that's a condition that you have to worry about. As older horses get aches and pains, and Dr. Fugaro can chime in on here too, exercise and movement is important. In all of the research that we've done over the last 25 years with older horses, if they continue to move, wander around the pastures, get on the equicizer, whatever, they actually showed less gimpiness or arthritic pain as they went through the research trial, just because they were more limber and they were moving around. So I think, guys, keeping an older horse in a stall is not a good thing for a variety of reasons. And again, the old adage, use it or lose it. And older horses do love to have a job, and they love to continue to exercise, and they can do so very, very well.
Thank you, Dr.
You're
Malinowski.
welcome.
And so Dr. Malinowski touched on exercising horses in the hot weather a little bit. So this segues perfectly into our next question, which will actually go to Dr. McKeever. So Dr. McKeever, this question comes from Taylor in Gainesville, Florida. What are best practices for cooling horses off after exercising in the summer heat?
Get my mute button there. Well, that's a huge question. When you exercise in the heat, you got to be cognizant of the temperature and the humidity, what sort of work you're performing. Excuse me. You want to watch the horse's physiology, the pulse, temperature, respiration. Make sure it's not showing signs of overheating. And there are charts out there on when to not exercise. So, you might look those up. We've got one in the lecture that I just did the other day. And depending on the heat and humidity, you can even overheat a horse at 70 degrees outside. So moderation is key. That sort of kicks back, and I'm digressing here to some of the comments that Dr. Malinowski made. With an older horse, just like humans, if you're going to exercise them, if they're lifelong athletes or they've been exercised their whole life, that's a little bit different than starting an exercise program for a horse that hasn't exercised for a while. So moderation, and tailoring things to the individual horse becomes important. But a horse that has been exercising and training in the heat is going to adapt to those situations. But again, you want to make sure you're not pushing the system too far to either heat exhaustion or heat stroke.
Thank you, Dr. McKeever. So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit from exercise to injury and exercise, and we're going to leave this kind of open for comment. Perhaps Dr. Fugaro, but many of you may have something to add on this. This question comes from Cindy in Bordentown, New Jersey. Cindy says, I own a thoroughbred yearling who must be stall bound for 6 weeks post-surgery for bone chips. Is she in jeopardy of bone loss due to elimination of exercise?
So there's some kind of missing information on that. Bone chips are a little bit, that'd be a long time to have a horse laid up for bone chips. Typically with chips, we find that those horses can get back into work quite quickly, especially a yearling. Now, if we're talking about a fracture, that's a bit of a different story. But the answer to your question is yes, horses that are standing around the box, we definitely tend to see changes. We particularly see it with post-fracture repairs when we put horses in casts the bones actually become osteoporotic. They actually have less density in them, especially with disuse. But those are really severe conditions. In fact, I think the mindset has changed quite a bit over the years. I know when I first came out of school, we kept the horses in the box for pretty much everything. And I think some of that has changed. If we can get them out and walk them and hand walk, if it's controlled exercise, we do that more and more. And the example I use is laminitis. You know, typically with laminitis horses, when they're really severe, we often would keep them doing nothing. But we found that over the years, if we can get them moving a little bit and get the blood flowing, it probably helps them a bit more than what we used to do. A lot of my tendon and ligament injuries, I don't put them back in exercise, but I actually have them out walking quite a bit. And I think that's a much better benefit than standing around doing nothing. So I do think there's more to that story as to why they put the horse up for 6 months. I think there's probably something that they're concerned about.
Well, thank you. We're going to piggyback off of that because Cindy asked a follow-up question that maybe goes more into nutrition with this similar situation. So Cindy asks, with so many leg injuries in racing thoroughbreds, can bone density in growing horses be improved through additional calcium? 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio being the minimum, how is that impacted with various hays? My concern is especially over the winter when green pasture is gone.
So 2-to-1 is just a ratio, and that's the ratio that should be maintained with calcium to phosphorus. But that says nothing about the levels of intake of their calcium and phosphorus. So, you know, you can have, 2 grams to 1 gram, or you can have, 4 grams to 2 grams, or you can have 8 grams. So see what I mean? You can have higher levels of calcium and still maintain that ratio. And you know, the nutrient requirements for horses, granted it came out in 2007, but there hasn't been a whole lot of new information out there saying that if you give horses mega doses of calcium, it's going to help their bones any more than their recommended levels. So I would kind of go back to, almost my answer for the last question is if they're on a well-balanced diet for that particular horse, meaning if they're a young horse and they're getting their adequate levels of calcium and it's a 2-to-1 ratio with phosphorus, that should be enough to keep their bones healthy. Now, as Dr. Fugaro said, there's a lot more that goes into it from, what environment are they in? Are they standing in a box stall? Are they racehorses that, were pasture raised? Because I know a colleague of mine at Michigan State University did a lot with bone density work and looking at yearlings and weanlings. And he looked at those that were in a box stall versus those that were allowed limited turnout versus those that were allowed unlimited turnout. And the ones that were on pasture and allowed to have unlimited turnout did have greater bone density as they got older and then as they went off to be racehorses. So I think environment plays a big role here as well.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And we do have one more question. This one came from Wyland, Massachusetts, on a similar thought, tying in nutrition of racehorses pasture and pasture. This questioner asks, what are your thoughts on the nutrition of racehorses and how pasture and diet tie into managing a racehorse?
And yeah, I think a lot of what I just said, but I have seen trainers race horses out of a field. It's not typically done, and I know not many of them do it, but if you can, that's the best source of nutrition for horses. That's where all of their vitamins and minerals are. They get a really well-balanced diet just out of pasture alone. So if it can be done, great. However, I know it's not typical and not a lot of people can manage a racehorse on pasture, let alone, I'm sure Dr. Fugaro is thinking right now, bring it on, give me all those horses that hurt themselves out on pasture because they do have so much energy and they need to burn all of that energy off. So I think it's a big management concern about having these high-level, high-dollar racehorses out on pasture. With that being said, if you can't do the pasture, the most important thing is high quality forage. So, get a hay that is maybe a legume grass mix hay that is an immature grass, lots of leaves, That's going to have, higher levels of the nutrients in it that they need, and let them munch on it all day long. Don't take it away from them. Let them pick away at it. Let them munch away at it. They're undergoing such high intensity exercise, and they're burning so many calories that there is very little to no risk of them actually getting fat by eating too much. And frankly, a lot of the racehorses that I've seen won't be able to eat that much, because a lot of them just kind of regulate their own intake when they are, racing at such high levels. So I think regardless of the animal, it does come down to the forage. But with that being said, obviously these horses can't maintain such a high level of energy on forage alone. So then you're going to have to look to the diet. Adding fat in the diet, I think, is a very good idea, because then you can actually cut back on the total amount of grain that they're getting, just because you're increasing the density of the calories so much. Because fat's actually almost 3 times as energy dense as most grains are, and which is a carbohydrate source. So I'm a really big believer of high forage and high fat diets for these heavily intensely exercising horses.
I can add one more comment in here, and I'm dealing currently with a client that's had a large number of boarding horses on a property, and we're having way too many colic episodes. And we really do think it's coming down to the forage. I mean, the fields have weeds out there, but they're really not getting anything there. And the quality of the hay that they're feeding is not great. And I have also changed my mindset, and Dr. Williams is going to be proud of me saying this. I have used more alfalfa now in my later years than I ever started out with. When I came out of school, we were always taught, oh, alfalfa is bad, can create all these negative things. But I think roughages we've gotten away from them too much, and we have to get back to them. They have to be a horse with it. And we think that they have great nutrition out in the pastures, and you really have to address your pastures to know if that's the case. Otherwise, we start seeing other medical conditions, and they're telling us we just have to listen to what they're saying.
Yep. If I may add one thing we didn't know from the question from Massachusetts is what breed of racehorse. And so if they are thoroughbred racehorses, which tend to be a little more flighty, then your concern that Dr. Williams brought up about getting injured out in the field is possible. But many standardbred horses successfully race out of a pasture. And, horses out on pasture mentally are much better off than they are being in a stall. And so, things like gastric ulcers, et cetera. So there's so many other problems that occur in racehorses specifically, or high performance event horses, dressage horses, whatever, that can be minimized by keeping the horse outside as much as possible. Let them be a horse.
Thank you all very much for those great insights. And so Dr. Williams, the next question is going to go back to you, since we're on the topic of pastures once again. And this question comes from Lisa in Ringgoes, New Jersey. She says, I had 2 horses out on a 2-acre pasture, and they've grazed it down to nothing. So she's gotten to this point. So how does she go about bringing it back, and how long does she have to leave it alone?
Well, I'm glad she said leave it alone, because I think that's the biggest problem I see with people wanting to renovate their pastures, is that come spring, they add a bunch of grass to it, they wait a month, and they throw their horses out on them. In order to get the root base strong enough so that it'll withstand horses grazing on it, meaning ripping the grass out, they really need to wait at least 6 months. So at least, and it could be more than that. So usually what we recommend is try to get some grass seed on the field in the fall. So usually mid to end of September. That way it can actually start to germinate and start to get a root base before it goes dormant in the winter. That way, once spring hits and it gets, a warm snap in early March or mid to late March, it will actually start to grow. You can leave it alone, let it go through its rainy cycle in the April and May, and then let the nice warm weather, the nice sunshine really let the roots grow. So you probably wouldn't be able to get them back out in the field until into August, maybe even September. And again, that all really does depend on the climate, because if we have a really dry snap in August and September, that's a problem, and you might have to hold off even longer. If we have really, really wet weather, then you might want to hold off even longer, again, because that way they're not going to be ripping the grass out by the roots again. So it really does take a long time to get that pasture established enough so that you can leave it alone for a while. All too commonly do I see driving by on a field every day, and I see they reseed the field, and then a month later the horses are turned out, and guess what? In another month they have no more grass. So if you do it right the first time, it's going to last a lot longer than if you don't do it right and you try to rush it, which is why rotational grazing is so good, because you can move those horses out of that field, put them somewhere else, not even think about that field for 6-8 months minimum.
Great. And I think now we're going to transition back to a little more of our manure management with Dr. Westendorf. So we have Jessica from Hackettstown, New Jersey, asking, what is the proper manure disposal method for small private farms in New Jersey?
Again, as has been said before this evening, it depends. If you have a relatively small farm, you may not have a lot of options in how you're going to manage your manure. Certainly, if you have the capability of doing it, to be able to take your manure, compost it if possible, and spread it back on certain non-equine grazed lands is the best option. But if you don't have the option to do that, then I would suggest some sort of a composting system if that's a possibility. Again, there's no real good solutions. To compost it on your own, perhaps to make it available to neighbors and other people who might be able to pick it up and take it for their own operations. Or maybe you have a neighbor who's able to use it in their farming operations. But again, this is a question we've been asked hundreds of times in the last few years, and there's no easy solutions to it. But again, it depends. If you want to chat with me more about it, please put your information in the chat box, and I'd certainly be willing to talk with you some more about it.
Great.
But I always promote composting if that's possible.
And then Dr. Westendorf, just one follow-up question to that from Tina in Franklin, Tennessee. She's concerned about the most economic process. She said that they have a nonprofit therapeutic riding program with limited funds, 34 acres divided into paddocks and pastures with 22 program horses and 1 retiree. And she wants to do better with her manure management, but is concerned about their limited funds. So do you have any recommendations on things that you can do even on a limited budget?
Well, I think I would defer to some of the things Dr. Williams said about pasture management. I think the first place you can start in your situation is to make sure you have quality pastures and quality fences and a quality plan for dragging your pastures and making sure you have the ideal grass growth. I'm not sure how you might currently be managing your waste. If your animals are stalled part of the day, you might be taking that manure and stockpiling it. I'm not sure. Certainly, if the majority of the animals' lives are on pasture, the majority of their day is on pasture, you're going to have some kind of exercise areas, exercise lots, where you're going to be able to manage your rotational grazing system. And certainly, if you do have exercise areas like that, you're going to have to collect your manure and on a regular basis. There's probably no good way to get around without disposing of some of your manure offsite, unless you have some land where you can spread it for other cropland.
Thank you, Dr. Westendorf. So we're going to take a little bit of a change of topic once again. So Dr. Fugaro, we're going to have a couple of questions now for you. So the first one comes from Lisa in Ringgoes, New Jersey. She says, I have a 24-year-old standard-bred rescue gelding. She's fostering. He had a bad infection in one of his legs. Turns out it was scratches left untreated. I've been applying Furazone and an antifungal, Microtech, and trying to keep him out of the mud. Is there anything else she should be doing?
There's a million things, unfortunately, and I'd love to say there's going to be one thing that's going to make the difference. There seems to be a demographic of horses that seem to be prone to this condition, and getting it to resolve is sometimes a bit of a challenge. When you're going through the episodes of a cellulitis that are getting in there through those scratches, which basically means an infection under the skin. Certainly sweat wrapping them. My combination of sweat wraps, I always like Epsom and Furazone together. But the first thing before you even do that is if I can get people to clip the hair down to the skin, that's very, very helpful. Clean these legs daily. You can use ivory soap. I mean, if you want to use a betadine, that's perfectly fine to go and do that. I have some of my farms where it doesn't seem like that's enough and they have to go to a more aggressive disinfectant on them, but cleaning and drying the legs are important. And then managing those legs, and managing it for me is to sweat those when they're swollen. Anti-inflammatory sometimes help, and exercise is going to be the next thing. And then you can't just leave it. You have to stay on top of it. As the swelling comes down, then you have to address the actual wounds of those scratches. And with those scratches, we typically get these little kind of wart-like proliferations. I'm a picker for whatever that's worth, and I like to pick those down to the healthy bleeding tissue. And then I have a scratches ointment that many of us veterinary practices use, which is basically a combination of a Furazone, silver sulfadiazine, Desitin, diaper rash cream. I put an antifungal and I put a steroid in mine. And probably of all those things that are doing the most is the steroid, and getting the anti-inflammatory properties of that. But the challenge is they're always a management challenge. And we always tend to find the feather-legged horses, our Clydesdales, our draft horses. They're the ones that are really prone to it. And they have a couple of medical conditions that set them up for that as well. But they tend to be a management challenge. I don't want to say a nightmare, but you're definitely committing your time. And after you go through one episode, and I'll stop being so long-winded, I'm sorry, Helen, is that once you have one episode, then you're a little bit more aware of it and you'll pick up on the subtle signs before it gets really bad. And that's how you get ahead of these, is to get up before they really get bad.
Okay, thank you. A lot of very useful information there. So we have another question for you. This one comes from Elizabeth in Canberra, Australia. And she wants to know how to prevent white line disease in periods of high rainfall.
That's a great question. So, one of my mentors really impressed upon me that a normal hygiene of the foot is farriery and actually trimming these feet. And you underestimate what just trimming the foot does on a routine basis. So that's going to be the first thing, is some of those horses have to be on a more frequent episode. Some horses have very poor horn growth or the quality of the hoof capsule, and they just seem to be more prone to it. There's a ton of different topical things to go in. And if you're in a wet environment and you have no solution to get out of that, then you've got to go with some type of topical solution. And there's a host of different ones. White lightning, thrush buster, copper tox. You can use bleach, but I always tell people be careful with bleach on the skin. You don't want that on the foot. It's fine. And I'm not talking straight bleach, usually diluted bleach. And we're just talking about getting on the white line. But if you're putting it on a wet, dirty foot, you're doing no help. You've got to dry these feet out. Sometimes what I'll have people do is put them in a boot and get them out of that moisture, but then you got to make sure the boot stays dry. I've had more of my clients more recently really loading up the boots with talcum powder, and that dries it up quite a bit. Or I just put them in bandages for a couple days, and that's always very, very helpful. So even with some horses, you don't ever seem to get on top of them. Sometimes some people feel that shoes are kind of a barrier for it, but I can't say that always. Sometimes that traps in the moisture. And white line disease, we don't really know the exact etiology. We think it's a combination of bacterial and funguses that get in there. And then it's usually a horse that grows an atypical or poor hoofed horse. Okay,
thank you. We have one more. It's kind of along a similar vein. And Dr. Williams, this might be one also that you want to jump in on, asking a little bit about supplementation. So this one comes from Audrey in Martinsville, New Jersey, and she leases a horse that's missing 30% of his coffin joint. She doesn't know why, either he was born with it or had surgery at a young age. Say maybe he's around 14. His arthritis in that foot is terrible, and it's getting harder to keep him sound, or as sound as can be. He's on pentoxifylline and aspirin daily. I'm not sure if he's still on Prevocox. Is there a supplement that would help him?
Is that for me or Dr. Williams?
Either one of you can take a stab at it.
You got it, Carrie. You got it.
No, a well-balanced diet. I mean, I keep going back to that, but it's true, you know, make sure that they're on the good quality forage. And, you know, if you want me to run your diet numbers and make sure that it's a well-balanced diet, I'd be happy to. Really, there's been no supplements that'll help soft tissue or bone remodeling or any of that stuff other than just a well-balanced diet. Mike, I don't know that you've heard of anything, but
no, the only other comment I would say is weight management is also key for a lot of these horses that tend to be, you know, limping around or lame. You know, if we have a tendency to keep them overweight, not that I should criticize, but it makes a difference on the joints and soft tissues, especially as they get older.
Yeah, I mean, really weight management with every horse. A fat horse is not a healthy horse. So we've seen way too many insides of fat horses that are really unpleasant. So.
All right.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
No, I figured you weren't going to say no on that. It's actually more to Mike in terms of what's the latest philosophy, because I think things have changed on manure spreading in pastures. You're muted.
Sorry, referring to what?
Is it still recommended to, if you have a pasture you're putting horses out on, do you spread manure out on those pastures, or you're trying to put it on other pastures?
I think it's generally you're going to, maybe Dr. Williams can jump in on this one too, but I think generally you're going to, your first place to put in, it's not going to be where you've got horses actively grazing. And certainly you're going to want to put it in a situation, you're not going to bed it heavily. And I guess if your horses are being wormed properly, you can do that, but I think it's generally not recommended to put, I don't recommend it to put on places where horses are actively grazing.
Yeah, I guess I agree. If you mean you're taking it from your manure pile, you're trying to get rid of your manure pile, you put it in a spreader and then you spread it on your fields. If you're doing rotational grazing, the time to do it is when you first rotate their horses off of it and you're letting that grass rest and regrow. That's the best time to do it if you have a rotational system. That way, it takes a little bit longer for, you know, the rain. It'll probably be close to a month before you're putting horses back on there. And like Mike said, make sure that it's not a super thick layer. It's just a very thin layer. But typically, the best way to do it is to get it composted first. And then you don't have to worry about any weed seeds, any parasites, because the heat, as long as it's composted correctly, has killed a lot of that material.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, that Carrie, that composting, if done correctly, it's gonna destroy most of the weed seeds and pathogens and parasites as well. So, but you're right, Carrie, that's great.
And I asked the question only because I have clients that probably don't have all the resources or maybe some of the knowledge with that standpoint, and they have to get rid of this manure in places, and where they have are their pastures that they can go and place it. So I think it's a challenge for some of them.
I think, as we said to a questioner earlier, that when you have too many horses and not enough acreage, you've got a challenge in how to dispose of your manure, and you don't have many options other than disposing of it off the farm.
Thanks.
Thank you guys very much. So we're going to go back to a bit of an exercise topic. So this one will go to Dr. McKeever, and it comes from Gavin in Casita, Alabama. It says, I like to run, and I always keep track of my heart rate with my Apple Watch. Should I be keeping track of my horse's heart rate while I'm exercising him? Is there any value to doing this? And how would I go about doing it if there is value in it?
So yes, there is value in it. When you track your own heart rate, depending on what you're training for, you want to stay in certain target heart rate zones. So with humans, typically you'll figure out your age predicted maximal heart rate. You take 220 minus your age, and then you want to be above 50% of that maximal heart rate to get aerobic conditioning, and you want to stay below 80% if you're going to be in that aerobic conditioning range. If you want to have sort of a mixture of aerobic and stressing or challenging the anaerobic metabolism side of things, then you can get up towards that 80% of heart rate max or above for short periods of time. With horses, people have tried to use heart rate monitors. You could do a little field test and figure out the maximal heart rate of your horse. That's sort of difficult. There's a paper out there that the folks in England did a number of years ago. I'd be happy to send you that paper. But in that paper, they tried to figure out a regression equation to predict what a horse's age-related maximal heart rate would be. We actually gave them some data from our geriatric horse study. But with horses, you want to try and stay in that above 50% if you want to train the aerobic systems, and you want to stay below 80% of maximal heart rate to train stay in that aerobic training zone. There are programs out there that you can have on your phone that will sort of predict what zone that horse is in. Some of those are really, really well done and useful. You have to input information on your horse that can generate the data that you need, but some of it's dependent upon what you're going to do with that horse. If you're going to do endurance riding versus, some barrel racing or something, you want to train the appropriate way for the type of exercise your horse is going to do.
All right, thank you, Dr. McKeever. So we did have a couple of questions in the chat, so I wanted to make sure that we did have time to get to those. So one quick question for Dr. Westendorf to follow up with some of his earlier comments on manure management and composting. How long should manure be composted before spreading, Dr. Westendorf?
Depends a little bit on how actively it's composted. If you compost it, put it in a pile, and turn it weekly or bi-weekly, you might have a fairly complete compost by 6 months with some curing period at the end. But if you're going to only turn it infrequently, you'll still get active composting occurring, but it's going to take longer to do it. So it might take you the better part of a year to compost in that sort of a situation.
Okay, thank you.
Was
Yes.
that the entire question?
That was the entire question. And then we have one last pasture management question that got popped into the chat as well. By acreage impaired horses, what is the minimum size for splitting a field for rotational grazing for a 2-acre field, as an example? Can it effectively be split in half, thirds?
So there are equations for this. I don't have them on the top of my head, but Gabriel, if you really want to know exactly, you can email me and I'll figure it out for you. But it's pretty safe to say that a 2-acre field for 2 horses can be in at least thirds. You might even be able to do them in half-acre sections. It's just your rotations are going to be quicker. We had a field a couple of years ago. It was a 1-acre field. We divided in half. We had 2 horses out there. Granted, during some of the periods of summer, when we call it the summer slump, because not much of the grass is growing because it gets really hot and dry, then we did need to pull the horses off the fields and put them in the stress lot and give them hay. Which, depending on the weather, might be the case regardless of how many you split it into. But I would say, you could even probably go with 3 to 4 sections in a 2-acre field for 2 horses and be okay.
Okay. Dr. Fugaro, I also have a follow-up question here for you that was submitted in the chat. Flavia wants to know, what are some of the medical conditions in draft breed horses that lead to scratches? Ooh. And what are some of the telltale signs?
So the condition, and of course, now that you asked the question, I'm going to forget what the name of it is, and it'll come to me as soon as I come off this call. But there is a genetic condition that some of the draft horses will have. They typically have swollen legs. Typically, they tend to get a lymphatic congestion, so the legs are always stocked up. They will have those permanent type of scratch scars on them. And what I mean by those is those kind of wart proliferative masses on there. And they just never get down to smaller feet or smaller legs than what we're expecting to get them to. And it seems to be very, very common in the draft breeds, particularly Clydesdales. And if it's the Flavia that I know, I can talk with you later on about it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fugaro. So we are almost done. We are going to take one last question from the chat, and then we have one kind of catch-all question that I'd like to get you all to weigh in on. So the one in the chat is from Gabriel. Gabriel asked, what sort of aerobic impact does an adrenaline-fueled horse increased heart rate from flight response experience?
So you want to repeat that again?
Yes. Gabriel asks, what sort of aerobic impact does an adrenaline-fueled horse increased heart rate from flight response experience?
Well, the cardiovascular system is going to be ramped up, but whether that's efficiently ramped up to actually benefit the exercise, that becomes the key question. I mean, you can make heart rate go through the roof, but whether you're actually pumping blood in an efficient manner that's going to benefit the exercise, yeah. So don't go giving your horse stimulants is the end point to make on that. You don't want the heart rate to go up unnaturally.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McKeever. Okay, so we have one last question. This was submitted by Debbie from Milford, New Jersey. And whoever wants to jump in and offer their opinion on this, we would love to hear what your thoughts are. Debbie says, we have a quarter horse breeding farm in business for 15 plus years. With this spring's foal crop, we have had issues that we have never had before. We had 3 foals as a result of breeding to 3 different stallions. They were fine at birth and didn't have difficult births. They were born 2 weeks apart from the beginning of April to the beginning of May. When the oldest reached around 5 months, we noticed that one had epiphysitis and was limping, and they all were becoming club-footed, mostly on one foot. We weaned them all and put them on Timothy hay and Buckeye ration balancer at 1 pound per day. They are on the picked over pasture all day with some Timothy hay and in at night. These foals were never pushed. We didn't creep feed, but they would nibble on mom's grain if they were allowed. Their moms were getting Purina and Rich Plus, beet pulp, and oil. Our fields had plenty of grass. They also do have a lot of clover. We don't have any foals due this year, and I would like to figure out what happened before I breed again. 2 of the foals are responding to tetracycline and trimming and cuffs. The other is having surgery this week to cut the check ligament. Do you have any ideas?
I guess that's where I'll start. I saw this article. I think, I'm not sure that I really see a true nutritional problem here. And that's the one thing that I saw when we read this question before. I hate to say that it was a condition of bad luck with it, and it may very well be, especially you'd commented that it was 3 different stallions. So I thought maybe it was going to be a breed line with it, but you kind of avoided all of the options there. So I think you probably did everything you could. And it just, sometimes these horses still require that aggressive therapy. So I hate to make that an easy answer, but I didn't find anything from what you described in there that I saw that was an error on anybody's part.
Yeah, Mike, I was trying to pinpoint a nutritional issue there, and the only one I could really come up with is, but then she said there's a lot of clover in the pastures, was the low protein. I mean, Timothy is not typically given to weanling horses because it's usually pretty low in protein, like around 10%, where weanlings require about 16% protein. So it's not always even an overfed issue. It could be an underfed issue. So, but then she said there was a lot of clover in the pastures, which would bring the protein in the diet up. It could be a mineral imbalance, and yeah, they are on the enrich, but the enrich, is it balanced for young horses? Well, they try to balance it well for all horses, really. And it's better than not giving them any balancer pellet. So yeah, I tried to pinpoint one thing, and I had a lot of guesses, but I think you're right. It might have just been, a combination of bad luck, weird genetics, perfect storm of things.
And Jen, I did look up my condition that I couldn't remember in my head, so I can just tell the group. The condition is called chronic, it's CPL, chronic progressive proliferative lymphedema. It actually wasn't around when I came out of school, so I just learned about it a couple years ago. That's an actual thing. I just thought draft horses had big swollen legs all the time, but it's actually a condition.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panel of experts. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions either in advance or via the chat during our event tonight. And Drs. Westendorf, Dr. McKeever, Dr. Malinowski, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Fugaro for all of your insight tonight. I should draw your attention to the chat, everyone. We did have a question that came in from Gabriel about accessing research studies done at Rutgers. So we've got a lot of replies in there. Kyle just linked to our library on our Equine Science Center website, so you can access any of the studies that were talked about tonight, as well as many others through that link. And again, as Kyle kind of alluded to earlier, that we would be able to take any additional questions through the Ask the Experts portal on the website. And I'm having some problems with sharing my screen here. I apologize. I was trying to share this with you to bring your attention that we still have our another event for you yet this fall, even though this is our last webinar in our fall 2020 webinar series. We invite you all to join us next week for our virtual evening of science and celebration next Thursday from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. And I'm sure Kyle can pop a link into the chat for you so that you can register if you have not already done so.
Jen, again, it starts at 7, not 7:30.
Sorry, 7. I was looking at the 8:30 and the 7, and I conflated the two. I apologize for that. Yes, we start at 7 o'clock, same time as all of our other webinars. We will start our virtual evening of science and celebration with the keynote by Dr. Karen Malinowski. And again, any of your questions that we didn't get to tonight, we will follow up with you via email through the Equine Science Center Ask the Experts inbox. I don't know if Dr. Malinowski would like to say a couple words at this point about the evening of science and celebration before we log off.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Weinert. Yes, folks, I mean, it's going to be interesting next Thursday evening. I know we're all going to miss the camaraderie. We're all going to miss the wonderful food that we usually serve on that evening, but this will work. And I will be presenting a lecture that I gave in Brazil in July on equine welfare, a new world for the equine athlete. And I've also invited, our guest speaker is Dr. Alan Page from the University of Kentucky's Gluck Equine Research Center. And Dr. Page is going to be giving us a presentation on the recent research that he's been doing with David Horhoff on using, can a blood sample actually predict a future catastrophic injury in a high-performing horse? The science is fabulous. Dr. Page is a great speaker, And I am really looking forward to hearing that talk. I mean, they've been working in this area, beginning with thoroughbred racehorses about 10 years ago, and now they have moved it to endurance horses. So high-end endurance horses. So it's going to be a good talk. We also are going to be presenting the Gold Medal Horse Farm Award. Dr. Westendorf will be presenting that to Centenary University. And the Spirit of the Horse Award will be given to Lynn Matthews from the New Jersey Department of Agriculture. So we're promising you we're going to keep it to an hour and a half at the most. And we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday night. It is at no charge, and all you have to do is register. So we'll see you next Thursday, guys. Thank you, Jan. Good job.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Have a nice evening. And like I said, if you have any follow-up questions, you can use the links that Kyle put into the chat. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.